The second part of your practice image here is going to focus on more of the effects, but I still want you to focus on really refining the use of the pen tool and how you're able to create those curves and really follow along with the outline as accurate as you can. But we're going to start out with this first shape here and just outline it, and then we're going to fill it and add a border to it just so that you can see how to, again, add those effects as you're working. But I'm going to pick a starting point and just click and let go for that first anchor point. Then I'm going to follow along with that straight line, click and let go to create that second line there. And then I'm going to find where this curve starts to change direction. So about in the middle here is where it starts to change direction and come back up. So I'm going to click here in the middle and pull to the side to try to line that anchor point up. And I'm going to let go. And for the second part of the shape, since I already have that handle there, it should line right back up with the rest of that curve. So I'm going to click again to complete and close my shape. Now over on the right side is where all of the different settings for the fill and for the shape are. So for this first one, we're just going to worry about adding a fill and then adding a border to it. So if you come down towards the bottom, it should say fill, and we're going to click on that little circle, and all of the different colors come up for it. So go ahead and pick any color that you would like to fill it with. So I'm just going to grab blue so it's different from that red color that it started with. And then I'm going to click off of it when I'm done. And right now you'll notice that all of those settings went away, and that's because I don't have my shape selected right now. So if your shape is not selected and you don't have those settings, you're going to want to click back on your selection tool, which in Gravit Designer is called the pointer. And this selection tool here, so this black arrow, is going to allow you to select a shape to edit or change. So right now when I try to click on my shape though, it's selecting the background picture. So it's not really letting me click on any of my shapes. So what you're going to have to do to fix this is lock your background image. So if you find your background image under your layers, you can click that little lock button there. So that's locking my background. So now when I click, it's not selecting that. It's only selecting the shapes that I created, which is what you want. So again, just lock that background layer and then click back on that first shape that you created so we can go in and add a border to it. Now same thing for the border. You're going to come to the right side and click on that circle, and you can pick a color. So I just chose yellow here. I'm going to click off of it. Again, select my shape so I can change some of the settings. But for that border, I'm going to give it a 5 for the width and then hit enter just so you can see the outline a little bit better. But any size will do just so that you can see that you added an outline. A few other edits that you can kind of look at and play around with that we may use in the future here on your portrait could be the opacity. So if you wanted maybe your shape to be somewhat see-through. The blending modes are there as well. So the blending modes are found in Photoshop that we've worked with. They're also in Illustrator. They're set up pretty much the same. So if I hit multiply, that's going to blend my picture that I created with the shape. So you can play around with blending modes, and those might be something interesting that you'll want to use in the future as well. I'm just going to set it back to normal, and we'll move on to the next shape. So I'm going to go back to the pen tool, and I'm going to outline this next shape. So I'm just going to find a starting point. So I'm going to actually start down here in the corner. I'm going to click and let go. And then I'm going to click for my next anchor point where this line changes direction. Then I'm going to click again where that next straight line is. And now I need to create that curved line. So instead of clicking and letting go here, I'm going to close my shape, but click and pull to the side. So again, I'm not letting go, but I'm pulling to the side to create that handle and line things up. So now I have this next shape, and I'm just going to right off the bat start with that selection tool so that I know I have it selected here. So I'm clicking on that black arrow, selecting my shape. I'm going to just grab any color. You don't need to add a border for this one because we're focused on opacity and blur. So for this, I'm going to lower my opacity, And then I'm going to come down to where there's a bunch of different effects, and I'm going to hit the little add button for the blur here. And you can play around with the size of the blur. So it's actually adding right to that red triangular shape that was in the background. So you can see that one through. But play around with the blur. This is something that you'll definitely want to use on your portrait to kind of blend or blur some of the shapes that are on top. So for example, if I come back to this image here, grab my selection tool, maybe one of these shapes on the face, so a highlight, I could come down and add a blur to so that it blends in with the image a little bit better. So that's something that you'll definitely be wanting to use as we get to the portraits here. I'm going to come back and move on to this next shape, which is a gradient and drop shadow. So I'm grabbing that pen tool, creating my starting anchor point, adding my next anchor point where that straight line extends. And then I'm coming to where that curve changes direction, or where I want the width of the curve to go to. And I'm clicking, and instead of letting go, pulling down and lining up the curve with that handle there. And since this curve continues, but I want a straight line extending off of it, I'm clicking back on that last anchor point, and then I'm just going to click and let go for these straight lines, come around to close my shape, and instead of clicking and letting go, I'm clicking and pulling to the side because I want that curve to extend. So now I have this closed shape, and for this one it says to add a gradient and drop shadow. So to add a gradient, that's going to be found under the fill. So just like we did to add a color, I'm going to click on that circle there, and where it says color fill at the top, you're going to click on this, and there's a bunch of different options that you can fill the shape with. So these are different types of gradients at the top. Linear is just going to be blending from one color to the next in a straight line. Radial is something that will come out from the center. So those two you'll probably use the most frequently. I'm just going to start with a linear gradient, and you'll notice it adds it right away. If you click on these two lines here, you're able to change the color of the gradient. So I'm going to start with where the white is. I'm going to change that to a blue, and then I'm going to click on this second line where the black is, and I'm going to change that to a different shade of blue. So up to you what colors you want to use. You can even add more colors into your gradient. So maybe in between the two blue colors, I want to add a white. So you can see that that adds a white in between the two. So you can click to add multiple there. So I'm going to come back and grab my selection tool to click on my shape. And the next thing that you're going to add is a drop shadow. So I'm going to come down under my effects, hit the add button for the drop shadow, and this is where you can just type in different numbers for your drop shadow. So 4 is going to give you a pretty average size for the drop shadow, so I would kind of start around 4 or 5, and then if you want it to be bigger, you can kind of go up from there. So here's what a drop shadow of 10 might look like. You can play around with the blur as well, so you can change what the blur is set to if you want it to kind of fade a little bit versus being a harsh outline. So I'm going to change my blur to an 8. Opacity you can adjust as well, but for now I'm just going to leave it there. The last thing I want to mention here before you move on to your last shape and save this to turn in is the difference between the selection tool and the direct selection tool, which are also found in Illustrator. But clicking on your shape, again, you're using the selection tool or this black arrow to select an entire shape, which will allow you to move it around. But I want to mention the direct selection tool, or the sub-select tool is what it's called in Illustrator. The direct selection tool allows you to click directly on anchor points, and you can edit what your shape looks like. So if you slightly messed up when you were outlining something, it's not a big deal because you can go back, move those anchor points around. You can even click on a specific anchor point to change the angle of the handle there, make it bigger so that you have a different curve. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward as well. But at this point, I want you to outline this flower, fill it in with a color, and then you're going to save this image and turn it in on Classroom. To save, it's a little bit different from Illustrator or the Adobe programs, but you're going to go to File, Export JPEG, and then just go ahead and save that somewhere that you're able to turn it in on Classroom to get credit for completing this image.